Well, today in this interview, we're gonna tackle a very interesting topic and one that is very related to Dr. William Lane Craig's material, and that is of the moral argument. Some of the chapter directors from Latin America submitted some questions to Dr. Craig, and we're gonna be discussing on those questions related to morality, ethics, the Euthyphro dilemma, and even more. So I want to welcome Dr. William Lane Craig that is joining us today. How are you, Dr. Craig?
I'm well, Raul. Thank you very much. I am delighted to have this opportunity to be with our Latin American chapter directors.
Definitely. It's always an honor to be with you and to learn from you. Last year, we discussed during an hour about the clam cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument. And this year, we wanted to tackle another argument that you're also very famous for putting forward, which is the moral argument. Now, before we go into the questions, I wanted to ask you, because I know that you're working on a book with David Baggett, one of your colleagues. Is there anything you can share with us about that project?
Yes, David Baggett is one of the most prominent Christian moral philosophers today. He has a very impressive series of publications with Oxford University Press. Dave now teaches at Houston Baptist University, where I'm affiliated. And so this past October, we team taught a course together on the moral argument for the existence of God. And David suggested to me, why don't we combine our lectures and publish them in the form of a book on the moral argument? And so we're doing that, and it is already under contract with Baker Bookhouse out of Grand Rapids. So that book will be forthcoming.
Yeah, it's going to be really, really good to see your interaction. And David Baggett, I know a little bit of his work, and it's really, really great on moral apologetics, and we will recommend everybody to get that book. Well, let's go ahead with the questions. Some of our chapter directors submitted them, and they touch upon a lot of topics, and we want to take advantage of you being here with us today. It says here, the first question. Dr. Craig, I know that you have worked a lot on the deductive version of the moral argument, and that is the one that we usually use and share on the Reasonable Faith animated video, which is already in Spanish. Yet there is another version of this argument, and that is the abductive one. Here, God is placed as the most plausible foundation for morality. What is the difference between an abductive approach and a deductive approach to the moral argument?
Let's look first at the deductive formulation of the argument. In a deductive formulation, the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises by the logical rules of inference. So I typically formulate the moral argument along the following lines. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, from which it follows necessarily, therefore, God exists. That would be a deductive formulation. I myself prefer to formulate the argument deductively because of its simplicity and clarity. I think it makes it very easy to grasp and makes it quite powerful. An abductive argument is an argument to the best explanation of certain phenomena. So, for example, you could formulate the Kalam cosmological argument as an abductive argument by saying, let's agree that the universe began to exist. Let's take that as our starting point. And now we'll ask, what is the best explanation for this phenomenon? And what you do is assemble a pool of live options, which are your competing explanatory hypotheses. And then you assess these hypotheses by various criteria to determine which hypothesis is the best explanation. So, applied to the moral argument, moral theorists like David Baggett, whom we just mentioned, prefer to have an abductive formulation of the argument. They say, let's concede that there are objective moral values and duties. Take that as your given. What is now the best explanation for those objective moral values and duties? And Baggett will argue that God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Now, notice that the abductive formulation takes it for granted that your interlocutor agrees with you that there are objective moral values and duties. If he doesn't, then the argument doesn't get off the ground. So I have used both forms of the argument. Typically, I use a deductive form, but if you'll look at my debate with Eric Wielenberg on the question, is the foundation of moral values and duties natural or supernatural? Because Wielenberg is an objectivist about moral values and duties, because he believes that there are objective moral values and duties, I argued abductively in that debate, claiming that the best explanation is theism, in contrast to Wielenberg's view, which is a form of moral Platonism. He grounds objective values in this Platonic realm of moral objects like justice and love and mercy and so forth. So those would be the two different ways to formulate the argument. It's really the same argument, but you just have different starting points.
Okay, that was really good. I always had that question on the abductive one. I didn't understand exactly where it differed with the deductive approach. Juan, I know that you also have a question for Dr. Craig. Would you like to go ahead?
Yep. Again, thank you, Dr. Craig, for sharing this time with us. So we know that God is the perfect representation of goodness and that goodness is grounded in Him. My question is regarding the metaphysics of this relationship between what we call goodness and God Himself. I think that we would agree that goodness in the doctrine of God is a quality of God or a property of God. If so, what is the relationship between this property and God? I mean, is God like an exemplifier of this property? Does God possesses this property necessarily? Is this property merged with God's nature?
I think, Juan, that the way in which we'll answer this question is going to depend upon whether you're doing heavy-duty metaphysics here or whether you're just talking in ordinary language. And since you framed the question in terms of the metaphysics of the relationship between God's nature and goodness, let me answer it in that way. I don't believe that there are any such things as properties. I think that these are useful fictions. It's a manner of speaking. But when we talk about God's goodness, I don't think that in addition to God, there is this thing called goodness. And somehow this thing is attached or connected to God. To say that there is a property of goodness that God has just means that God is good. Or to say that I have the property of being 5'9" just means that I am 5'9", or that I have the property of being the husband of Jan Craig just means I am the husband of Jan Craig. So I don't place any metaphysical weight on the existence of things like properties and natures and things like that. So the view that I defend is that God, who is a concrete object, not an abstract object, God Himself is the foundation of moral values. He is the good. In the same way that the meter bar in Paris was the standard of measurement for what constitutes a meter, that concrete metal object was a meter, I would say the concrete object, God, is the standard of goodness. Now, in an ordinary language sense, to revert to a more lightweight manner of speaking, I would say, of course, God has the property of being good, and of course, he exemplifies this property. And indeed, God exemplifies this property necessarily. It is part of the essence of God to be good. So indeed, this property is part of God's nature. As a maximally great being, it is essential to God that God be good. It is impossible that God not be good. So speaking in a lightweight sense, I would affirm that God exemplifies this property necessarily and that it is essential to God.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. And just a quick follow-up. Do you think that your answer to the latter question, that it's like a philosophical position that you hold, would it be different if, let's say, things like theories like realism is in fact true? Do you think that this change could affect the moral argument that you defend?
Well, now, the word realism here, Juan, is ambiguous. Usually in moral context, to say that you're a moral realist means that you do believe in the objectivity of moral values and duties. And I certainly do believe that. I think theists in that sense are moral realists. But I think what you're talking about is what I call moral Platonism. Platonism is a form of realism that posits abstract objects as the bearer of value. And I don't accept that sort of Platonic realism.
Thank you, Dr. Craig.
Very well. Now, you just mentioned that, and I'm going to go with the third question because it's very related to what you just said. In answering the Euthyphro dilemma, you stated before, and I quote, "The correct alternative is to say God wills something because he is good. That is to say, God is a standard of goodness. God is what Plato called the good. God is the good, and he determines the standard of goodness. The good is not something that is independent of God, to which God conforms, nor is the good based on God's will in his arbitrary decision. Rather, God himself is the good, and he is that way by his very nature." So my question here would be, if God is the good, how do you distinguish this from a strong view of divine simplicity, where God is his properties, God is his love, God is his goodness, and so on and so forth?
I do not think that my affirmation that God himself is the good commits me to divine simplicity, a view that in fact I reject. Think of that meter bar in Paris that was the standard of the length of a meter. If that meter bar also weighed, say, exactly 1 kilo, it could also serve as the standard of weight for a kilo. A kilo would be whatever that bar weighed. So the same bar could serve as the standard of both weights and lengths. And yet you're not thereby claiming that the length of something is the same as its weight. So I don't see that claiming that God is the good and the standard of goodness in any way commits me to divine simplicity.
And that was a really interesting analogy. I appreciate that.
Thank you. It's not original with me. That's from Brian Leftow, a Christian philosopher who was Richard Swinburne's replacement at Oxford University for many years. I found that a very apt analogy.
Yeah, really good. On that same note, I know that Antonio has a similar question. Antonio, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Raul. Hi, Dr. Craig. I am glad to be here with you. I just want to mention that I am the guy who married with a young woman who attended to my chapter, and this argument was the key move for conquest her. So thanks a lot for your work in this argument. And well, I want to ask, related with, maybe have relation with the Juan's question and the role. In your work on God and abstract objects, you seem to suggest that God is omnipotent without needing to exemplify the abstract property omnipotence. Could not certain concrete moral properties, such as justice or love, exist without the need for them to exemplify an abstract entity, thus avoiding a Platonist foundation, but at the same time have a secular foundation?
My difficulty there is that things like justice and love don't seem to be concrete objects. I can't imagine that those values would exist as concrete objects. They are abstract objects. They're properties that something has or exemplifies. So it seems to me that if you want to have a sort of realism that appeals to things like justice and love, apart from God, you're going to need to posit them as abstract objects. They don't seem to be concrete things.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, David, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Dr. Craig. I just want to say that it's a huge privilege to speak with you personally. Very few persons have that privilege to speak with one of the most influential philosophers in these modern times. So I am blessed for that. Thank you, Doctor. And the question would be, if you were an atheist, what would be the most convincing argument you would use to refute the moral argument?
I suppose that since there are only two premises in the deductive formulation of the argument, and since the first premise, that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, seems to me to be just obviously true, I suppose I would have to deny the second premise and affirm moral nihilism or relativism and simply deny that there are objective moral values and duties, and claim that we are all massively deluded in thinking that that is the case. I don't see how else to avoid the argument.
And I believe everybody is grateful that you are on our team and not on the other team.
Well, I'm glad that I believe in moral values and duties.
Okay. At this point, I want to check if any of the chapter directors in the audience sent any questions. I believe Saulo sent his. Let me read it here. Okay, this is from Saulo from Brazil. It says, in the ontological argument defended by you, which was formulated by Alvin Plantinga, God is considered the greatest conceivable being, or maximally great being. Number one, what would be the moral properties pertaining to this greatness characteristic of God in the ontological argument?
Well, for Plantinga, it would be moral perfection. God would need to be a morally perfect being in order to be maximally great. And I think that's really intuitively obvious, because any being that is morally imperfect in any way is obviously not as great as it could possibly be. So it does seem that moral perfection is an inherent part of maximal greatness.
And as a follow-up, do those properties, or are those properties the same that are defended in the moral argument? Is there like an overlap?
Yeah. Well, I think he was looking for something a little more specific. So what goes to make up moral perfection? Well, it would be things like God's agape love. That would be a moral perfection. Also, his perfect justice and holiness, that would be a part of moral perfection. And so, yes, those are the sorts of moral values that one is talking about in the moral argument, that things like justice and love are goods.
Okay. Another question that also popped into mind is that usually when you're saying something like this, moral perfection or God is, or a maximally great being would be worthy of worship, doesn't that commit us to some kind of intuition? Like, okay, this is what seems like worthy of worship to me, and then that would make us fall back into subjectivity?
Oh, I don't think it makes you fall back into subjectivity, but it just does mean that if you want to cash out what goes to make a being worthy of worship, then you're going to talk about things like moral perfection, because moral perfection is obviously a part of what would make a being worthy of worship. A morally imperfect being might be very admirable. We might have tremendous respect for such a morally imperfect being, but we would not give ourselves to him in adoration and worship. I think very plausibly moral perfection is required to be worthy of worship in the true sense of that word.
Okay, so the distinction would be between admiration and worship. That's a good.
Yes, absolutely. This word worship here carries a lot of weight for me. It's not just admiration, respect, or holding someone in high esteem. We do that with human, finite, imperfect people all the time, but we don't worship them, or at least we shouldn't.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, another follow up with Saulo, and then we'll go back to the questions that were submitted. Does that moral perfection mean that God has a chance to do evil?
This is a great question that I am exploring in my systematic philosophical theology in the section on the goodness of God. And here, I think it's very helpful in talking about omnipotence to distinguish between the strength of one's power and the range of one's power. I think God certainly has the strength required to do any evil act. He could perform it. But I do not think that the range of what God can do includes doing evil acts, because it would contradict his very nature. He cannot act contrary to his own nature. And so I would say that while God has the ability, in the sense of strength, to do evil, that it's not possible that he does evil, because that would be contrary to his character.
Very well. Antonio, would you like to go with the next question?
Okay. Okay, I have this question. Some have claimed that your version of the argument is circular, for they do not see clearly how morality depends on God in your argument, unless you already assume that God is the foundation. One way to understand the problem is through the following reverse moral argument. Premise 1, if there are objective moral values and duties, then God does not exist. Premise 2, there are objective moral values and duties, therefore God does not exist. Right off the bat, the relationship between moral realism and the non-existence of God seeming clear to me. Will not the relationship between moral realism and the existence of God be just as ambiguous?
Now, here, several things need to be said, Antonio. First, I want to reiterate what I said earlier about moral realism. Moral realism is usually taken to be the belief in the objectivity and of moral values and duties. And in that sense, we theists are moral realists. So there's no competition between moral realism and theism. Theism is a form of moral realism, as is Platonism, which would be a different form of moral realism, a form that I reject. Now, the truth of the objection is that in the two premises of the argument, it is not explained or clear how God is the foundation of objective moral values and duties. All the argument shows is that God does exist, and that if he did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. It shows that if objective moral values and duties do exist, then it follows that God exists. But there's nothing in the argument itself that explains how this is the case. And so in order to do that, I need to supplement the moral argument with a moral theory about God's relationship to moral values and duties. And that would be my defense of what is called divine command theory. And according to the version of divine command theory that I defend, God himself is the foundation and standard of objective moral values, and his commands to us constitute our moral obligations and prohibitions, so that these are grounded in God. And so divine command theory is an attempt to explicate how God is the foundation of moral values and duties. So there's no circularity in the argument, but it is true that the argument doesn't itself explain how God is the foundation of moral values and duties. To do that, you need to supplement it with a theistic theory of morality. Now, the version of the sort of reverse moral argument that you gave is just patently fallacious, Antonio. The first premise: if there are objective moral values and duties, then God does not exist. That is false. The converse of the first premise of the argument, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, is if objective moral values and duties do exist, then God exists. And so this parody of the moral argument is simply inept. It's based on a false premise.
All right. Now that you touched upon divine command theory, somebody submitted a question related to that. And that is, how do you respond to the objection that this is arbitrary? That if God determines right and wrong, or that let me flesh this out, that our moral obligations are determined by his commands, then that makes those moral obligations arbitrary.
Yes. There are versions of divine command theory that are voluntaristic. William Ockham, the brilliant late medieval philosopher, held to a sort of voluntarism where God just decides what is good and evil, right and wrong by his almighty will. But that's not the version of divine command theory that is widely defended today, and especially championed by Robert Adams, who is probably the premier moral Christian philosopher today. On Adams' view, moral values are grounded in God, just as that meter bar at the Bureau of Weights and Measures in Paris is the standard for being a meter. So God himself is the paradigm and standard of goodness. And that goodness, that moral nature, is then expressed toward us in the form of divine commandments that constitute our moral duties and prohibitions. And it would be impossible for God to command things that would be contrary to his moral nature. Now, I do think there are some moral obligations that we have that are arbitrary. One pastor suggested tithing. For example, God could have commanded that we give 11% of our income rather than 10%. That seems to be an arbitrary choice on God's part, and yet given that God has commanded you to tithe, it would follow that you do have a moral obligation to do it. But for the most part, the important moral values and duties that we are aware of are not arbitrary in that sense, but rather they are reflections of the very being that God is, his nature.
Yeah, I like that example, or it's more relatable than the example you've given before of God commanding us to not eat beans.
Oh, well, you know where I got that example?
From where?
The ancient Pythagoreans. Pythagoras and his followers would not eat beans. It was morally prohibited to any of Pythagoras's disciples to eat beans. And so that was where I came up with that silly illustration of an arbitrary command.
Well, it is going to spark some discussion of is tithing still relevant in the New Testament and stuff like that.
Right, and I'm not suggesting that it is. So don't extrapolate my remarks that far.
Yeah, of course, but well, the audience sometimes takes things too far. Okay.
Yes, of course, and I didn't mean to be misunderstood in that respect.
Sure, I'm just teasing.
I think that the New Testament principle of stewardship is to give as much as you can, to be as generous as you can be after meeting the needs of your family and yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I subscribe to that view as well. Okay. Question. The next one, I think it's David. It's your turn.
Thank you again. In the same spirit with the previous questions about divine command theory and stuff, I would like to ask a matter about the distinction between terms, because some people talk about this moral argument talking about objective moral duties and values, and other people say that there are absolute moral duties and values. So for example, there are philosophers like Peter Kreeft that subscribe with moral absolutism. But in your book, you mention the moral objectivism. So we could agree that the distinction between these terms are key to understand the argument. But is it important to distinguish these terms? Is there a key difference between this, or could we use at the same time without differentiation these terms, Dr. Craig?
You notice that I do avoid using the word absolute with respect to moral values and duties. And that is because I do think that our moral duties are often relative to our situation. For example, is it morally wrong for someone to plunge a knife into the stomach of an innocent person? Well, if you're a surgeon, no, that may be your moral duty to operate on this person. But if you're a thug who is assaulting someone in the street, then that would be morally wrong for you to do. So the action is not absolutely wrong. It is relative to the person and situation involved. But in that situation, there is an objective right and wrong. There is something that you objectively ought to do and something that you objectively ought not to do. So I emphasize the word objective moral values and duties rather than absolute, lest I give the impression that moral duties are not relative to person, time, and place, and so forth.
Okay, so just a little follow-up question. For example, under the background of moral objectivism, we could explain better, for example, episodes in the Bible, for example, the midwives in Egypt lying to Pharaoh, saying that the Hebrew women are strong and they give birth by themselves. So they were basically lying, but God blessed the midwives. So we can explain those episodes in the Bible under moral objectivism rather than moral absolutism,
Yes,
right?
that would be a good illustration, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
I guess another illustration that has also come up in discussions like this would be Germans hiding Jews during the Second World War, right? They were basically lying, but for because of a greater good, which was preserving the lives of the Jews.
Yes, right.
Okay, let's go with the next question. Many atheists say that morality is a matter of biological evolution and not of a transcendent reality binding on all. To this end, they say that the values such as empathy, compassion, love, or altruism can also be found in animals. What would be your case to refute these claims?
What I would say is that the notion that the evolution and development of moral values proves that they are non-objective commits the genetic fallacy. It is a textbook example of the genetic fallacy. What is that fallacy? That fallacy is trying to explain away or invalidate a viewpoint by explaining how the person came to hold it. So, for example, someone might say, well, your belief that democracy is the best form of government is just because you were born in the United States, a democratic society. Now, even if that were true, that does nothing to invalidate the truth of the belief that a democracy is the best form of government. Similarly here, the fact that moral values and duties are the product of evolutionary development and societal conditioning does absolutely nothing to prove that moral values and duties are not objective. So I think this commits a genetic fallacy. Now, there are ways to finesse this objection that I discuss in my book, Reasonable Faith, in the moral argument. And so if you're interested in pursuing this a little bit further, take a look at the discussion in Reasonable Faith of this particular objection.
All right. Somebody just texted me this question. Let me read it here. Is our Western culture the substrate for the second premise of the deductive approach of the argument? For instance, to demonstrate the existence of objective moral duties and values, the Third Reich example works only when speaking with someone who also thinks that the whole situation was objectively evil. How do you demonstrate the second premise to someone who does not share the same cultural context as ourselves?
If there are objective moral values and duties, then it follows that there can be whole cultures, whole societies, which are so morally warped that their perception of objective moral values and duties is inaccurate. And I would say National Socialist Germany would be one of these. So would apartheid South Africa. And indeed, in some ways, contemporary American culture and society is terribly warped in its values of materialism and consumerism and selfishness. So what you have to do with your interlocutor is just probe a little bit, ask questions. And I think after a while, if he's honest, he will admit that there are some objective moral values and duties that he holds to. I've seen this again and again. For example, after one speaking engagement, a young Black man came up to me and said, I don't believe that there are objective moral values and duties. And I said, really, you don't? And he said, no. And I said, you mean to tell me you don't think that racism is wrong? And he paused and looked at me and he said, well, I guess I do believe that that's wrong. And I think he realized for the first time he does believe in certain objective moral values and duties. So just appeal to examples that this other person would share. And I would say examples of religious atrocities would be especially powerful with non-Christians. Ask them if they don't think that it's morally wrong for priests to sexually abuse little boys, and then for the Catholic Church to try to cover it up by moving the priests to different dioceses. Do they really think that's all right? Or what would they think if we instituted in our country the Spanish Inquisition and began to burn people at the stake because they didn't hold to the same religious beliefs that we do? Don't they think that would be morally wrong? And honestly, if you're dealing with an honest person who's not just trying to put up an intellectual smokescreen, I think very quickly you'll find that that person does believe there are objective moral values and duties.
All right. Well, something very similar to this would be, couldn't this notion of objectivity be explained by a deep human psychological state? That is, could these concepts be just projection of our own emotions into reality?
Well, it's certainly possible, but again, we have to be careful not to commit a genetic fallacy where you show that someone holds to a certain belief because of psychological pressures or dispositions to hold to that. That doesn't mean that therefore the belief is false. And I would simply invite someone to explore his moral experience and ask himself, is this just the result of a deep psychological state, or do I in fact apprehend objective moral values and duties? And as I said a minute ago, I think with the vast majority of people, if they're honest, they will come to agree that there are at least some objective moral values and duties.
Before going into the last question, with kind of mixes things up between your work on the moral argument and the historical Adam, I wanted to ask you as well, because I haven't heard you say something or mention this. Do you agree with C.S. Lewis that if you do like a survey on all peoples and all cultures, there are like these universal kind of behaviors that exemplify this moral, the moral realm, that the objectivity of the moral realm?
Now, I am not an anthropologist, Raul, but my understanding is that this is the consensus view among anthropologists today, that there is a kind of basic moral code that permeates virtually all cultures. Now, these moral values may come to different expressions in different cultures. For example, in some cultures, it would be regarded as immoral for a woman to have her arms uncovered. But in other cultures, women may go bare-breasted, and that's not thought to be immodest. So there's a common value there of modesty, but how modesty comes to cultural expression will be relative to the society. Now, I would say that even cannibalistic cultures, for example, are actually do affirm the intrinsic value of loving your neighbor as yourself. I've been told that when members of a certain tribe kill and cannibalize members of another tribe, they do not think that they are violating the command to love their neighbors because they don't regard members of this other tribe as their neighbors. They would never cannibalize someone of their own tribe, but for someone of another tribe, he's not regarded as a neighbor, and therefore he's legitimate prey. So paradoxically, again, even though the cultural expression of these values may be radically different, there does seem to be a kind of deep underlying moral code that all cultures and societies share.
All right. So this is a really interesting question. Taking into account the interesting view that you propose on the historical Adam, that he comes from the line of the Homo heidelbergensis species, and the concept of objective morality, which depends on an external moral agent, and that is God, what would have been God's reasons for choosing that specific species and to have them endowed with this conception of morality, if it seems that their development up until that point did not require a moral awareness? Basically, taking into account that this non-moral or amoral development led the process of human evolution to have significant advances in terms of community or symbolic reasoning, what would God's reasons be to endow at that point with this moral awareness?
Assuming an evolutionary perspective, these lower hominins like Homo erectus or Homo naledi were not fully human. They had a brain capacity that was too small to support rational thought, and therefore they were not rational agents. But when you get to Homo heidelbergensis, you arrive at a human species that had a brain capacity comparable to modern man, and who therefore could sustain rational thought. And therefore, as rational agents, they would be able to understand and make moral choices. And so what God does is simply wait until these hominins have evolved to such an extent that they are capable of supporting a rational soul. And then once they are at that point and have a rational soul, then they become moral agents in virtue of their ability to reason rationally and make moral choices.
All right. Somebody just sent one last minute question, but before we go into that, I want to ask you a personal question. And here it's going to be depend on you if you break my heart or not.
Oh gosh.
What is I don't know if what would your favorite superhero be? Would you be a DC fan or a Marvel fan?
Well, I would be a DC fan. I was actually quite the aficionado as a boy in collecting comic books. I had things like the original Justice League of America #1. I had the #1 Spider-Man when it was still called Amazing Fantasy before they changed it to the Amazing Spider-Man. I sold my comic book collection a few years ago for around $10,000 to help renovate our kitchen. And I suppose it was the DC characters that I liked the most.
Oh man, I admire you even more right now. Yeah, I'm a DC fan too. Have you watched any of the newest movies, DC or Marvel?
No, I don't, and I'll tell you why. I'm kind of disillusioned with a lot of contemporary movies because they all seem to be just special effects with very little good acting in them. When you compare these movies that are made today with older films like Gaslight with Ingrid Bergman in them, or Notorious with Claude Rains and Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman, or The Third Man with Orson Welles and Joseph Cotton. I mean, these were great films with deep personalities, with tremendous actors. And so I find these older films to be so much better than just blow 'em up, shoot 'em up, as Jan calls them.
A great response, and yeah, definitely number one philosopher on my list. Very well. So the last question, and I think it's really apt for us to close, it would be, what advice would you give to those interested in delving deeper and becoming a better representative of the moral argument?
Well, I do think that you need to read Reasonable Faith and master the defense of the moral argument that is there. But then beyond that, I would suggest reading Robert Adams. For example, his book, Finite and Infinite Goods, is brilliant. And then of older authors, William Sorley was really great, and I would recommend his work. And then there are, on the contemporary scene, defenses of the moral argument that are worth reading as well. But I think they don't rise to the standard of the authors that I just mentioned.
Very well. Well, that would be the end of our questions. Dr. Craig, we really appreciate your time, and thank you for the responses. They were really thought-provoking.
Good. And I just hope that all of our Latin American directors will be zealous in the Lord's work, that you'll be trusting Him to do great things through you, and to extend His kingdom and build disciples all around Central and South America.
Will do, and we hope that maybe if you have more time, maybe this year or maybe next year, we can delve into another subject with you. It's really, really enriching.
Very good.